Okay, so this video lesson is going to focus on the poem Checking Out Me History by John Agard, and it appears on the AQA Power and Conflict Anthology. So, what's this poem about? Well, identity in a word. The poem is about searching for identity whilst under the power of oppressors, about the segregation of black and white history. It raises questions about how we are educated about past events, and how history can be obscured by race and gender. I mean, who decides what's taught in schools? Who decides which part of history is involved and which part of history is ignored? The title references the decision taken to re-examine all he was taught in school about white history and rewrite it to include black history, which is just as valid and important. And a summary of the themes covered: identity, anger, power of humans. So, a bit of context about Agard himself. He was born in Guyana in 1949, but moved to Britain in 1977, and much of his poetry explores identity and ethnicity. Guyana was a British colony up until 1966, and as a result of that, Agard's education was a very British-focused one. He didn't learn much about his Caribbean roots at school. This poem was published as part of a collection called Half Caste and Other Poems in 2007. The key areas to focus on in any of the poetry analysis and other literature texts as well is form, structure and language. So I've lifted out some observations about form, structure and language in this poem, and then, as with all the other videos, I will then go on and analyse the poem in a lot more detail, kind of on a line-by-line basis. So form first. The narrator uses a mixture of stanza forms, suggesting he's breaking the restrictive language rules he's been taught. I must say, method and meaning again. Identify your techniques, that's great. Your poetic devices, that's great. That will get you your grade 5, no problem. But to get higher than a grade 5, then you need to explore interpretations, impact, meaning. What was the poet's intention behind the use of these techniques or this device? So, for example, a mixture of stanza forms. That's the method. What's the meaning of that? Well, we can infer that he's breaking the restrictive language rules he's been taught. There is an absence of punctuation, which could symbolise Agard's refusal to accept restrictions that were placed on him by the European-centric education he received. Method and meaning. The poem also takes the form of oral poetry, with a strong rhythm and phonetic spellings. Reading the poem aloud, as me, a white person, forces me to acknowledge Agard's own identity as different to my own, but equally as valid that there should be no segregation. It often mimics, which uses rhyme scheme to build to a climax to reveal the most important part of the stanza. So, for example, balloon, moon, spoon, and then nanny de maroon, which is the important part of the stanza. Enjolment, that's a run on lines, occurs throughout, which serves to emphasise an overflowing of anger, uncontrollable. It also forces the reader to combine great black and white historical figures because they belong together, despite never having been taught together. When these white figures are portrayed, there is a childlike rhyme scheme, nursery rhyme almost in style, which mocks the presentation of these figures. Compare this to the presentation of black figures, which are written in italics in free verse with much shorter line lengths and no rhyme, lending more gravitas to them. Structure. The poem alternates between famous historical and fictional figures from both Caribbean and British culture. The Caribbean figures appear at the end of the stanzas, giving them greater significance. However, the last stanza ends with the narrator exploring himself or his own identity. This suggests that he ends the poem with a renewed sense of his own identity, of who he is, as a result of challenging everything he's been taught before. Then language and imagery. Okay, a couple of observations here. Repetition of dem throughout reflects the anger he feels at having his own history ignored or denied him. Shorter lines when discussing black historical figures helps to make them more serious, to reinforce his anger. He names many black historical figures he's proud of and admires, and states that they belong in the same sentences as famous white historical figures. The verb, even, carving, in the final line suggests that we have to be active in seeking out our own identity, that his own history has empowered him, energised him. The metaphor towards the beginning, where he states they bandaged up me eye, blind me to me own identity, is powerful in conveying the damage his one-sided education has caused, and probably the many subsequent years he spent trying to work out, exactly who he is and what his background is and where his roots are. Okay, so analysis of the poem. Dem tell me what dem want to tell me. bandage up me eye with me own history, blind me to my own identity. Dem tell me about 1066 and all that. Dem tell me about Dick Whittington and he cat. But Toussaint Louverture, no dem never tell me about that. You have to excuse my pronunciation, perhaps. Okay, a bit of analysis here. Immediately indicates the importance of the persona's voice, sets out that we are all important. Who are them? Repetition of them and me sets out the separation between them and us, the British education system from Agard. Metaphors for concealment, deliberate attempt to conceal history, bandage up me eye, blind me to my own identity, or certain parts of it, maybe a nod to slavery perhaps. Remember I said, who decides what's taught in history at school? What's left out, what's included? Dismisses British history and all that, yeah, and all that, like etc. and all that. Uses pantomime to highlight farce of taught history in schools. Dick Whittington and the cat, that's not important history, it's a pantomime. They should be focusing on more important things, real things. No, dem never tell me about that. Double negative reflects the anger and frustration felt by the speaker. And this is but Toussaint Louverture. Whoops. Someone's going to email in and correct me, I'm sure. First mention of important figures from a diverse background. Questions why these figures aren't also taught in British schools. Implies a racial tension at the whitewashing of the history that was taught. And this person was a famous ruler who led the slaves in the Haitian Revolution against the French. Okay, next. Right. Toussaint, a slave with vision like Lickback, Napoleon, Battalion, and First Black Republic born. Toussaint de Thorn to the French. Toussaint de Beacon of the Haitian Revolution. So the italics here signify a shift in syntax and structure. Irregular rhyme, but the rhythm is like a drum beat, perhaps mimicking the famous oral Caribbean tradition of telling stories. The beacon, the metaphor, beacon is a shining light, linked with vision, contrasting with the earlier blindness. So the European-centric history he'd been taught, or the British-focused history he'd been taught in schools, was blinding him to who he was. But once he discovers all these famous historical figures from his Caribbean past, it's like shining a light. His vision is restored. He sees who he is far more clearly. The repetition of forcing a confident mood in connection with these famous figures and their positive impact. Okay, then tell me about the man who discovered a balloon and the cow who jumped over the moon. Remember the contrast between the kind of nursery rhyme mock tone with regards to the British figures, fictional figures. Then tell me about the fish ran away with the spoon, but then never tell me about Nanny de Maroon. So continuing the strong them against us theme, now using nursery rhymes to trivialise British history, but also as a nod to storytelling. Nanny de Maroon, Jamaican national hero, led slaves against the British. Stanza builds up to what he hasn't been taught. The importance of this figure in contrast to the silliness of the nursery rhymes. Nanny see far, woman, of mountain dream, fire woman struggle, hopeful stream to freedom river. Vision again, perhaps a wisdom. Use of natural imagery to describe her, implying freedom and hope. And it implies fire woman, implies warmth. Dem tell me about Lord Nelson and Waterloo, but dem never tell me about Shaka the Great Zulu. Dem tell me about Columbus in 1492, but what happened to the Caribs and the Arawaks too? A reminder that there is more than one version of history, but he's only been taught one, that one eye, that blinded. Comparison between restriction and freedom. Shaka resisted slavery against the European colonisers. White versus black history, both equally important. And the final parts of the poem now. Dem tell me about Florence Nightingale and She Lamp, and how Robin Hood used to camp. Dem tell me about Old King Cole was a merry old soul, but dem never tell me about Mary Seacole. So contrasting figures from folklore with real life figures, a Jamaican nurse who helped the sick in the Crimean War. From Jamaica she travelled far to the Crimean War. She volunteered to go, and even when the British said no, she still braved the Russian snow, a healing star among the wounded, a yellow sunrise to the dying. Does the speaker identify with Seacole, or is he giving a voice to someone who has been silenced in the history books, explaining why he's elaborating on her story, perhaps? Again, associating images of light and warmth with important figures from Black history, illuminating his own cultural background. Is this dismissing the biased history he's been taught in school to the dying? Dem tell me what dem want to tell me, but now I checking out me own history, I carving out me identity. So this is kind of mirroring the opening stanza. Or actively seeking his own identity, that carving and checking. Ending the poem with the newfound sense of who he is, empowered by what he's learned, his own history, but expressing concern that it's not taught in schools and questioning why. Okay, that's plenty of analysis there on the actual poem itself, a bit of background to Agard, and some comments on form, language and structure. Plenty enough for you to get your top grades there. But just a summary of the poetic devices used, which you can use in your analysis: mixed stanza forms, free verse, nursery rhyme, enjolment, oral poetry, short lines, juxtaposition, phonetics. Useful vocabulary to use when analysing this poem and comparing it to another one: anger, admiration, celebration, identity, historical, culture, diverse, roots, passionate. And links to other poems on the anthology. Obviously take advice from your teachers and make any decisions yourself, but you could link it to identity as key in Tissue, or anger in London, or individual experience in the Emigre. Okay, I hope you found this useful. See you on other videos. Bye now.